Well, so the impetus really for doing this conference was there's a fair amount of criticism of some of the conferences that are happening now, and some of the activities like hackathons and things like that, and where people are asking a lot of questions about, well, what's the value? Is it worth doing this? Why are we doing these things? And now, I personally think that there is value that comes out of doing those conferences, except I do think that's maybe sometimes we need to do more than kind of just have people talking about things at conferences if we really want to move things forward, right? And that's really the idea here is, can we come together, can we identify opportunities where if we start measuring, we start getting more disciplined, if we gather data, if we collaborate, maybe we need to create clearinghouses, things like that, can we do the things to really help the industry move forward? The idea is, right, to set an empirical research agenda. And, just this Yogi Berra quote, you've got to be very careful if you don't know where you're going because you might not get there, right? And this is kind of going back to the improvement kata question, where I think sometimes when we talk about technology, we have a lot of shiny technologies, but it's like, well, wait, what are we actually trying to do? What problems are we trying to solve? I think there's a lot of things that we're talking about that sometimes we need to stop and say, wait a second. Where are we trying to go? Where are we now? What are we really trying to accomplish? What obstacles do we face? How are we trying to overcome them? So why measure legal services quality, innovation, and technology? I've given a couple of anecdotes throughout the day today. I'll give another anecdote that I think is that helps define why the power of metrics in this space. So Jim Sandman at the Future Law Conference 2 years ago gave a really great talk talking about 10 ways to move the legal industry forward to improve access to legal services. Many of the things he talked about, I don't think anyone's really picked up and acted upon. One of which was this idea that we need to stop ranking law firms on revenue and profit. We should rank them on technology adoption, on innovation. And I came back to Michigan State and put together a team of students and actually worked on that. It was the next Future Law Conference that I came to. It hadn't been done, and I thought, well, how can we build a minimum viable product? This seems like a really difficult problem to solve, but what if what if I got some students together to work with me, gathered some data, and started trying to measure these things? And I'm not going to spend time talking about this. A few of you have seen this, but what I want to get to is just, so measuring some of this on law firm websites, creating a catalog of law firm innovations, and then and there's a measure for each of 260 law firms, the AmLaw Global 100, the AmLaw 200, and the top 30 in Canada. So it attracted a fair amount of attention, as did this law school innovation index that I put together, a prototype of it that I want to keep building out, right? But again, so how do we capture some metrics around this to describe what's going on, and so it's not just anecdotes and intuitions about what's happening in the marketplace? And Bill Henderson, who was scheduled to be here, and I'd hoped he'd be here, wrote a great article about this, which I really appreciated, kind of talking about the impact something like this can have. And he talked about the psychological phenomenon of reactivity, right? And so he expected it to be influential. And in fact, it got shared a lot. I've had a lot of lawyers at law firms and marketing people reaching out to me and asking about it. The Tableau visualizations have had well over 20,000 views now. So it got some traction, right? And in some ways, I'm kind of pretty sheepish about this because it's like, okay, I just used Google search to scrape some websites and try to put together some measures of innovation, but there was nothing else out there, right? And so no one had done it. And so how do we keep kind of building on this? And when we think about some of the other problems we're trying to solve, when we think about access to legal services, for example, how do we kind of capitalize on some of this, that when you start measuring things, right, and do it in a responsible way so we get the outputs that we want to see. But there's kind of a lack of measurement. And I think one of the other things that I wanted to hit on here is that, it's fun to talk about innovation, doing these things, but it takes discipline to actually innovate. And so if you're in one of the roles like Gwen is in, or Jeff's trying to do these things, or Chase, like, okay, it turns out it's hard to actually do this stuff, right? I mean, we talk about, in some ways, that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the legal industry, and there are ways you can stand out. But when rubber hits the road and the client says, okay, what's the value? What am I actually paying for here? It's tough. It's tough to do these things. And when you read about what it takes to innovate, you find more and more research. Larry Keeley at Illinois Institute of Technology talks about innovation almost always fails because of a lack of discipline, right? And so asking kind of like, how can we get more discipline? So why measure legal services quality, innovation, and technology? This idea of moving from opinions, anecdotes, and intuition to data. Let's capture some data. Let's measure what's actually happening. introduce transparency, right? In the case of law firms, transparency for clients. In the case of law schools, transparency for prospective students, current students, they know what's going on. It's helpful for law professors, others, law deans, right? Other administrators to be able to see, to be able to say, well, oh, gee, it turns out they're doing it at Northwestern, Harvard, and Stanford. Maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea if we tried it, right? If it works in that order, yes. Raising awareness. Empowering consumers. Well, the thing I really want to hit on too is accountability, right? And I think, we talk a lot about access to justice. We talk about access to legal services, improving our justice system, increasing diversity, right? Are these, are these just platitudes, or are we committed to actually solving these problems? And if you look at, a lot of people talk about solving these problems, but if you look at the progress made in the last 20 years, we're not doing so good, right? And so how do we really say, gee, okay, we're part of this profession, we're part of the legal profession, we've benefited by having this monopoly and the ability to deliver legal services. Let's hold ourselves accountable for, let's get disciplined, let's start setting some clear goals, let's measure where we are, let's start setting target conditions, interim goals, and let's start getting more disciplined about the progress we're going to make. And so this is where, the improvement kata is really just a scientific method, right? It's the scientific method for knowledge generation, creation, for learning. And we also do training on design thinking. We have Margaret Hagan here, she's great. Agile, the agile process is a lot of it. At bottom, almost all of these are really just talking about the scientific method, the fact that you have ideas about the world, but you've got to go test your hypotheses, and you learn by doing that. And so how can we kind of incorporate that into the things we do as far as creating an empirical research agenda? So the improvement kata comes from the Toyota way. We talk about that a lot here in our program. These twin pillars of continuous improvement, so constantly iterating through, improving things. Also this idea of respect for people, which I think is very important and can help us in the legal industry to think about that. Respect for people doesn't mean just the niceties about greeting people pleasantly and things like that. It means if you respect people, you actually coach them and develop them to be the best that they can be. And I think in a lot of ways we've lost a little bit of that in the legal industry. I know, and I think a lot of law firms, right, we don't do a great job of coaching and mentoring. And I also think that one of the things that's nice about this improvement kata, also we tend to be very autonomous beings as lawyers, right? And we sometimes don't like being actually coached and managed, right? But it kind of helps to strike this balance between this idea that, sometimes law firm management is you kind of throw them in the deep end of the pool, and if they can swim, yeah, it turns out they were smart enough, they were good enough to do it, right? And it's like, okay, well, where's the mentoring, where's the coaching? And I think this helps figure out, what is our obligation as leaders as well to create a framework for people to succeed within. So if you're a leader, how do you set the direction and challenge? And then, you're the one who sets the direction as the leader in an organization. You coach other people, though, through this process to learn. Sometimes they fail, right? But by coaching them, investing in people, empowering people, that's how they keep improving and help you create a learning organization. So I want us to think about, and I'll talk a little bit more about how in this space we can think about this as a framework for generating a research agenda. Okay? Thinking about, and in this room we may have a couple of different groups that would focus on particular problems, but what is it we're trying to do, right? How do we know we're there? How do we measure it? And then how are we making progress towards getting there? And part of this could be like to grasp the current condition, understanding what research is actually out there, and then when you set target conditions, saying, okay, identifying the obstacles to getting there. How do we overcome those obstacles? What sort of research do we need to do to be able to overcome obstacles? How do we measure that? Those sorts of things. And this idea, again, of not jumping to conclusions, not making assumptions, very similar to design thinking again, too, like this idea that you don't innovate in a boardroom somewhere. You go to Gemba in Toyota talk, right? You go where the work is being done. You go talk to the people who are actually doing the work and empower them. But we can use some other tools as we go through this. One of the things that I was talking with Jim earlier and I mentioned is that identifying research questions and then maybe just trying to figure out on an impact matrix. Right? And we've got folks here from law firms, from law schools, from the judiciary. We've got people who are connected to corporate legal departments. I'd hoped we'd have someone from corporate legal department here. Someone from a legal startup, right? What are the questions? Or the idea of putting it on an impact matrix to say, okay, where do we think, what are the high impact, low resource ideas? Okay? Kind of creating this agenda, but then identifying, well, what are the things that we think are really going to have an impact, and that we have the information, we have the resources to actually be able to do that. And so, and I've got a handout, and I'll pass it around just a second so you can remember this, because the idea will be then that I'm trying to set the stage here a little bit about thinking what we want to accomplish. And then this afternoon, we're going to hear from Dean Rodriguez, Justice McCormick, and Professor Lupo, and they're going to talk about some of their research, but we're going to have time for working in between. And again, I think I want this to be somewhat organic and people to get engaged and try to figure out, people have different interests in the room, but what could we have at the end of the day on Saturday that we can write a blog post about, or we can start a clearinghouse, or whatever idea it may be that we think we can have an impact and try to move people forward. This is a small conference, but I also think that the idea is that, okay, you get a handful of the right people in the room who really are disciplined about having a strategic plan can actually really make a difference too. Just one other anecdote that I wanted to share. I think this is an example of why just thinking about relying on intuitions and anecdotes. And I think we see a lot of this in the discussion. And I was out at this Codex conference, and Hillary Bass made a comment that all of us, we should be building ODR systems for small claims. All small claims should be online dispute resolution. I mean, seems like a great idea to me, right? A little bit in a way, maybe it's solution jumping, right? Jumping to some idea with, do we really know what's going on? And now Hillary's the leader. She's the president of the ABA, like, so kind of throwing the gauntlet down and putting this challenge out there. Well, that's perfect, like a rallying call. So this was retweeted a ton of times, like 70 times, liked 111 times. But then, Frank Pasquale retweeted it, and he said, he quoted an article, "In pursuit of judgments, collectors have swamped small claims courts with a torrent of lawsuits. So should we try to automate and speed up the process whereby debt collectors instrumentalize courts to seize consumers' assets?" So he's kind of like throwing an obstacle out there in the way of this. And this is good, right? This is great, this kind of dialogue. But what do we do with this? How do we start getting more disciplined to say, and I kind of responded back to kind of saying this, kind of thinking in the terms of the kata, right? I mean, what's the current condition? How many defendants just default and never get any kind of day in court with the way it currently works? We could have substantive justice and meaningful due process with ODR. Yes, that's a potential obstacle. We have to be concerned about how creditors are going to use the courts or use online dispute resolution systems. But let's get beyond just identifying obstacles. Let's talk about how we can overcome them. Like, what do we need to be able to overcome the obstacles here? How do we make sure that we go out and understand? That's a big part of design thinking, improvement kata, when you understand the current condition. Human-centered design, talking to debtors, talking to creditors, talking to judges, talking to the people who are actually in the system, not just deciding how we're going to solve a problem and kind of throwing it out there, right? That's when you see colossal failures, when you haven't done that kind of understanding the current condition, getting out there, trying things, prototyping, user testing things. So that's the idea behind this, about asking, again, now this is a framework, and you've got sticky notes at your tables. And so the idea is that when we're listening to Dean Rodriguez, Justice McCormick, and Professor Lupo, that we'll be thinking about, okay, what's the direction or challenge? And just saying, oh, I'm committed to justice, I'm committed to increased access, well, that's not quite good enough, right? Like, what are we actually really trying to accomplish? Where are we trying to go? What does that mean? How do we know when we've arrived there? Grasping the current condition, and then identifying obstacles, and then thinking, how do we overcome those obstacles? And the target condition is kind of like setting an interim goal, and it can be time-based, or it could be based on the goal or something like that in some different way. But this idea, you don't try to do everything all in one fell swoop. But kind of for our purposes today, the idea is just thinking about, do we really know where we're trying to go? Do we understand the current condition? What do we need to do? What kind of work? And of course, I'm interested in what could academics contribute to this, but academics then working with practitioners, and there's a lot of space here. This isn't just about access to justice, but what are law firms interested in? What are other players in the legal ecosystem interested in as well? So what's the current state? How do we measure these things? This goes to the stuff that ETI is doing, measuring quality of legal work that's being done, the stuff that Maura Grossman and Gordon Cormack are doing. What are the obstacles we're going to encounter? How would we overcome them? What experiments would we conduct? Okay? So this is going to require engagement from you guys to think about, what are the things that we think that we want to try to work on in these 2 days? What are the questions we think ought to be asked? Because as far as I know, I don't know that anyone's really done this. Tried to start. There's pockets of it, and I've talked with Allison a little bit about. There's some pockets. University of Kansas City, Missouri is doing a little bit. There are a couple other places who have bits and pieces. John Mayer with Cali has pulled together some syllabi and things like that. Jim, you're doing some of this, going out and learning about and trying to pull that knowledge together. But how do we kind of capitalize on what seems like these great opportunities right now? This kind of, it's almost like an inflection point in the industry to say that, okay, what are the questions we really need to answer to help move forward and achieve these goals, right? To turn access and an improved justice system into more than just platitudes, into we've got a plan, this is how we're going to do it, and we really can measure the progress that we're making. So, any questions? Or so, yeah, Dean Rodriguez.
Who's the audience? Who are the audiences?
Yeah.
For this?
Yeah. Well, I think the idea of the empirical research agenda, for the most part, I think is the academy in a sense, right? But it's asking, so they're an audience in the fact that I'd like to see, and I think there are opportunities. I mean, I think some of the work Natalie's doing at Thomson Reuters is kind of thing that those have been opportunities that the legal industry, we've done some of that work, and folks like Bill Henderson have done some of that. Jim's doing some of this kind of work. Allie Gerkman, we were talking about her work, about trying to figure out, well, what's going on, what competencies, what's the culture like, and that sort of information. So there may be multiple people that are involved, but of course I'm a little bit self-interested as someone who'd like to stay in the academy and thinking about, okay, what's the work to be done here that is really going to add value? And so Justice McCormick, I'm really interested in hearing you're going to teach us access to justice class at the University of Michigan. What kind of things do you wish more academics were doing? So you had so when you have an idea like Hillary Bass, for example, that we are doing the work, so you could say, okay, that's a good point, Frank. There may be some problems, but look at this work folks have done to try to gather data around this and things like that. But so I think there can be, that's kind of the first level audience as far as who we can influence here. I think there are others in the legal ecosystem, but then of course those folks who are doing that work should be thinking about what are the questions that others in the legal ecosystem have that are worth answering. Any other questions? Seem doable? Okay. Okay, so everyone has sticky notes, and I want to pass out this chart. And again, I think another exercise that we do a lot of with Agile, it's actually an Agile Scrum retrospective, is this idea of start, stop, continue. And we could do an exercise around that, but it's also another way to kind of like just frame your thinking about things. So as we're thinking through this, I've had the good fortune of hearing Dean Rodriguez's talk at the Chicago Legal Innovation Meetup, and so I think we'll get a lot of ideas from that, just like thinking about, okay, what are the questions that we have? What are the opportunities to change legal education? What are the things we should be researching and doing and measuring so that we have a better understanding of what we can do inside of law schools, for example? Natalie?
We're going to be listening to the speakers to help spark ideas.
Yes.
About what is the direction or challenge, and then there's going to be a process where we narrow it down?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, but I want to and so I'm hoping people will figure out the things that they're interested in and yes, to figure out maybe a specific challenge to want to tackle.
That everyone's going to work on.
Know that we can have subgroups working on too. And I think that would be the idea, is that we'd have subgroups. And maybe a handful of people who are more focused on the academy will say, we want to work on the empirical research agenda for what professors should be doing to improve legal education.